12-year-old choir girl named Hannah Whitmore vanished in 1983 during a spring recital in the quiet town of Maple Glen, Oregon. For 15 years, her family lived with silence until one afternoon her father opened her old practice cello, tucked away in the basket. Inside he found something no one expected, a hidden clue that would unravel a chilling truth and bring them closer to finding out what really happened to their daughter. The rain that night wasn't gentle. It drummed relentlessly against the stained glass windows of St. Catharina Chapel, slicing through the sleepy silence of Maple Glen like a restless pulse. Inside, warmth glowed from the hanging lanterns, casting golden halos over the pews filled with parents, siblings, and neighbors. A hush fell as the last note of Handel's Messiah faded into stillness, followed by thunderous applause. Among the young voices that had filled the chapel with ethereal harmonies was that of Hannah Whitmore, only 14, yet her voice had been described by her choir instructor as a bell rung from heaven itself. She had stood second from the left in the front row, her hands clasped tightly, the blue velvet robe draped gracefully around her tall, slender frame. Martin and Laura Whitmore sat beaming, their hands raw from clapping. They were proud parents, though perhaps more quietly than others. Martin, the high school librarian, wore pride like a heavy wool coat, visible but never ostentatious. Laura's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her purse. Still shaken from a stressful week at the pharmacy, she managed. They waved to Hannah as the children filed off stage, disappearing behind the curtain that led to the choir's changing rooms. Hannah smiled back, her eyes twinkling with a mix of pride and teenage fatigue. That was the last time anyone saw her. An hour later, as the congregation slowly dispersed and the custodians began dimming the lights, Martin leaned against the side pew, checking his watch for the third time. "She's taking a while," he muttered. Laura frowned. She probably got caught up chatting. You know how she is after a performance. But when they knocked on the choir room door, no one answered. Inside, the changing area was quiet. One overhead light flickered weakly. Hannah's robe, still damp from the rain, hung on a hook beside her rehearsal shoes. Her street clothes were missing, but oddly, her umbrella and scarf were still tucked in her cubby. Laura's breath hitched. Martin scanned the room like a man trying to remember something he'd just forgotten. They walked the hallways, called out softly. Then, with rising panic, the custodian said he'd locked the east doors 20 minutes prior. No one had seen a girl exit alone. By midnight, local police had arrived. Dogs were brought in, scent traces were attempted, but the trail ended abruptly near the back corridor leading to a locked supply door. There was no sign of struggle, no note, no indication of whether she had walked away or been taken. Maple Glen was small, the kind of town where everyone knew which kids had braces and who borrowed whose mower. The kind of town that didn't lose its children. By sunrise, the Whitmores' tidy blue house became headquarters. Volunteers poured in, printing flyers, organizing street searches. The school gymnasium was turned into a temporary coordination center. And at the heart of it all, Martin moved like a ghost, methodical and numb, while Laura cried silently into mugs of untouched coffee. But one detail continued to unsettle him more than the silence: the church's security cameras. St. Catharina had invested in a full surveillance setup 8 years ago after a string of local break-ins. Yet when police asked for footage from the night Hannah disappeared, the chapel's elder, Mr. Rowe, shook his head apologetically. "We've been doing upgrades. The system's been down for nearly 2 weeks." Martin's eyes narrowed. "Upgrades? Without notice?" Mr. Rowe hesitated. "It was supposed to be routine. We didn't think it necessary to inform parents. It's always been safe here." But that word, safe, started to lose its meaning, especially when Martin visited the company responsible for maintaining the system and learned they hadn't received a service call from St. Catharina since June. Laura refused to leave their house for the first month. She kept Hannah's bedroom exactly as it was: bed made, books stacked, a violin resting neatly under her desk. On the wall, a corkboard held photos of Hannah at birthday parties, school trips, and last Christmas, where she stood grinning under mistletoe, unaware her life would soon vanish like breath on a windowpane. Weeks turned into months. Tips came and went. A reported sighting in Portland turned out to be a runaway from Idaho. A letter claiming to be from Hannah was proven fake, written by a troubled teen craving attention. The police scaled back. Media attention waned. But Martin kept digging. One afternoon in early March, he revisited the chapel alone. The same flickering bulb hummed overhead in the choir room. As he stood beside the hook where Hannah's robe once hung, something small caught his eye, a smear of blue chalk on the underside of the wooden bench. Almost like a fingerprint, or a desperate mark. The world hadn't moved on, not really, but it had learned to pretend. And Martin, he had begun to count time not in days or weeks, but in the quiet moments when he swore he could still hear her voice, faint as it was, drifting between the raindrops. 3 weeks after Hannah vanished, the search began to thin. The flyers, once fresh and bright, had begun curling at the edges, sun-bleached and speckled with rain. The school resumed classes in a state of muted confusion. Teachers spoke in softer tones, students whispered in hallways, and lockers clicked shut a little slower than usual. At St. Catharina's Choir Club, where Hannah's voice had once soared, the silence became unbearable. It was during one of these hushed rehearsals that 13-year-old Molly Sander, second soprano, turned to her mother with something that had been gnawing at her. They were driving home, rain scattering across the windshield, when she finally said, "I think Hannah had a fight with Mr. Miles, like a big one." Her mother, startled, asked what she meant, and Molly recounted an afternoon just days before the performance. She'd arrived early for practice and heard raised voices in the choir room. Peeking through the door's glass panel, she saw Hannah standing stiffly, arms crossed, her face flushed. Mr. Carter Miles stood inches from her, gesturing sharply. Though she couldn't make out the words, Molly remembered one phrase Hannah had said. Her voice clear and cold. "You can't control me like the others." Molly's mother pressed her lips together and shook her head. "Sweetie, that's probably nothing. He's strict. Maybe she just didn't want to rehearse." But Molly persisted. "He grabbed her arm," she whispered, and she pulled away. They never told the police. Molly's mom feared it was just teenage dramatic acts, and besides, accusing a respected teacher without evidence was dangerous. And so the memory faded into the gray fog of town unease. Martin, meanwhile, was visiting the library less, but researching more. He dove into local archives, searching for patterns, anything that might explain why a girl could vanish without a trace. His search was sterile, fruitless. Laura rarely left the house now. She'd begun locking Hannah's bedroom door, a strange habit Martin dared not question. Then, in early February, a substitute music teacher arrived at the middle school. Mr. Carter Miles, Hannah's choir director, was suddenly gone. No announcement, no farewell. The principal merely said he was on indefinite leave. But in March, Martin, passing by the choir room on a rare visit to the school, overheard 2 teachers talking near the vending machine. "Miles didn't even file for a transfer," one said. "Packed up, left town, whole family, overnight." The other nodded. "No forwarding address. Said something about going west. Oregon City, maybe." Martin's blood ran cold. Carter Miles had been a fixture in Maple Glen for nearly a decade. Passionate about classical music, he was known for running tight rehearsals and demanding excellence from his students. Some found him inspiring. Others, like Hannah, had recently begun to question his methods. Martin remembered how Hannah once said during dinner, "He acts like he owns our voices." He had laughed it off then, mistaking it for teenage exaggeration. Now he wasn't so sure. He started asking quiet questions. He approached a few parents, gently, carefully. Some recalled Carter as intense but harmless. Others admitted they had felt uncomfortable, though they couldn't pinpoint why. One mother, whose daughter had graduated 2 years earlier, revealed that Carter never allowed private lessons with the door open. "I thought it was strange, but he had results." The kids won awards. Martin pushed further. Through a colleague at the local community college, he obtained Carter's old employment file. There was nothing incriminating, no formal complaints, no suspensions, but there was a note tucked inside the final page, dated 6 years earlier. It was unsigned, a memo scribbled in hurried handwriting. "Concerns raised solo practice session." He drove to Carter's last known address, a faded duplex near the west edge of town. The blinds were drawn, a for rent sign tilted in the unkempt lawn. Neighbors had little to offer. "Left in January," one said. "Took a moving van. Didn't say goodbye. I figured he got a better offer somewhere." Martin called the leasing company, but the new tenant had already moved in, and Carter's forwarding information had been marked as private. It was as if the man had vanished too, only this time deliberately. Back at home, Martin spread out everything he'd gathered on Hannah's bed: a copy of her class schedule, rehearsal notes, 2 blurry photocopies of school yearbook pages, a hand-drawn seating chart of the choir loft. He circled Carter's face with a red pen. He couldn't shake the feeling that the argument Molly had witnessed, now verified with hesitance by 2 other students, had been more than artistic disagreement. Something had snapped, and 2 months later Carter had slipped away, just like Hannah, except no one was looking for him. Laura stood in the doorway, silent, watching him. She held a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "You're doing it again," she said softly. "Lining things up like they'll spell her name if you arrange them just right." Martin looked at her hollow-eyed. He left Laura. No notice. Just gone. "Who does that?" It was covered in stickers, stars, cats, a faded quote about music being the voice of the soul. "You never read these," she said. She always kept them locked, but I found the key in her pencil case. Martin took it with trembling hands. He didn't read yet, not then, but as he held the book something inside told him this was not the edge of the pattern. It was barely the edge of it. The year was 1996, and the Whitmore house on Ashgrove Lane hadn't changed much since the winter Hannah vanished. The porch still creaked in the same places. The front door still jammed unless you leaned your shoulder into it. But inside, the walls felt emptier. Laura had passed away the year before, quietly in her sleep. After more than a decade of hoping, grieving, and quietly unraveling, her departure had left Martin alone with silence that wasn't just quiet, but deeply hollow. Now, with no family left in Maple Glen and retirement just months away, Martin made the decision to sell the house. It wasn't easy. Every corner whispered of Hannah, the pencil marks on the kitchen doorway showing her height over the years, the faint scent of her shampoo lingering in the linen closet, the Polaroids still pinned to the fridge door like faded artifacts of a time that no longer existed. Martin started clearing out the basement on a cool March afternoon. Dust blanketed everything: the old sewing machine, boxes of outdated textbooks, and music stands that hadn't held sheet music in over a decade. In the far corner, behind a stack of firewood, lay a long rectangular case wrapped in a heavy canvas cloth. It was Hannah's first cello. The varnish had dulled, the metal clasps rusted slightly, but Martin remembered how proud she was when she first opened it, on Christmas morning, age 10. He placed the case on the workbench, brushing off the dust before unfastening the latches. The lid creaked open with a reluctant groan, revealing the velvet-lined interior. The cello itself was still there, its strings slack, bow resting diagonally across the fingerboard. Martin gently lifted it out, more for memory's sake than practicality. As he checked beneath the velvet padding, out of habit, out of grief, out of something deeper, his fingers caught the edge of something stiff lodged between the lining and the wooden base. It wasn't a forgotten receipt or a lost string. It was a yellowed envelope, brittle at the corners, sealed but worn from time. No name on the front, no address. He stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether to open it at all, but then his hands moved, almost involuntarily, tearing gently along the seal. Inside were several folded sheets of thin paper, handwritten letters, their ink slightly faded but legible, and at the bottom a small Polaroid photo, the kind that developed in minutes back in the early 80s. Martin unfolded the letters first. The handwriting wasn't Hannah's. It was precise, formal, older, not cursive but deliberate. At the top of each page was a symbol, drawn in fine blue pen, of a key wrapped inside a dahlia flower. He frowned. The imagery was strange, meticulous, and oddly haunting. He read the first page. Day 20. She no longer speaks unless asked directly. She plays well in the mornings, less so in the evenings. Light interferes with focus. We've moved to artificial settings. The natural world proves too distracting. Martin's blood ran cold. He flipped to the next. Day 38. She weeps often at night. This is expected. Transition is difficult, but progress is measurable. I remind myself, the goal is purity, not comfort. He couldn't finish the third letter. His eyes dropped to the photograph. In it, a girl sat in a hard-back chair, holding a cello between her knees. The room was dim, lit by a single overhead bulb casting sharp shadows across the concrete walls. There were no windows. The floor was dourous. The airway's face was turned slightly downward, partially obscured by a curtain of brown hair, but Martin knew her. The posture, the shape of her fingers on the neck of the cello, the curve of her cheek, every line etched itself into his memory. It was Hannah. He staggered back from the bench, heart pounding. The photo wasn't dated, there was no signature, but she looked older than 14, maybe 15, maybe 16, which meant it had been taken after she vanished. Martin read one more line from the fourth letter before the paper slipped from his trembling hands. She is nearly tuned, not healed, not helped, tuned like an instrument. The envelope held no return address, no names, no clear clue, but that symbol, the key within the dahlia, it was specific, intentional. Martin had never seen it before, but he knew it had to mean something. He set the cello down, his hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped it. He didn't call the police, not yet, not after all these years. He didn't know what to tell them. A 13-year-old envelope? A photo of his daughter in what could be any basement in America? He needed more, proof, context, a trail. He spent the next 2 nights not sleeping. He copied the symbol onto a notepad. He searched the phrase, key and flower symbol, into every online forum and archive he could find. Results were vague. Fragments of secret societies, obscure cult imagery, a few references to European esoteric groups. But nothing concrete. Still, one pattern emerged. The dahlia, he learned, was historically linked to themes of dignity and betrayal. The key to knowledge, kept or taken. Together, they formed a contradiction. A paradox. And maybe a signature. On the third day, Martin returned to the cello case. He dug deeper, inspecting every inch, pressing on the seams of the lining, tapping the wood for hidden compartments. Nothing. But he was sure now this envelope hadn't simply fallen in, someone had hidden it. Someone had come back, maybe years later, and slipped it beneath the velvet where they knew Martin might one day find it. Or maybe where they hoped he never would. As evening fell, Martin placed the letters and photo into a folder. He opened Hannah's diary again, the one Laura had given him months ago. For the first time, he noticed a small sticker on the inside back cover. It was shaped like a flower. Not a daisy, not a rose, a dahlia. Martin stared at the small dahlia sticker in the back of Hannah's diary as if it had bloomed there only yesterday. The memory of the symbol in the cello letters haunted him, but it wasn't until that precise moment, quiet and cold in the dimly lit hallway outside her old room, that something clicked inside him. That symbol had been familiar not just in its unsettling uniqueness, but in its design, in the rhythm of how it was drawn. A looped stem, a detailed center, a careful outline. It was obsessive, methodical, and Martin knew he had seen that obsessive hand somewhere else, long before Hannah vanished. The next morning he unlocked the old cabinet in the garage where he kept his school life, documents from his years working as a librarian at Maple Glen Middle School. Rosters, old newsletters, meeting minutes. At the bottom, half-warped by time, was a beige leather binder, the faculty timekeeping log from the 1983 school years. Back then, teachers had signed in with pen next to their names in the logbook, often scribbling initials or full signatures depending on their mood. Martin flipped through page after page, ignoring the smudged ink and age-stained corners, until he found a section marked. And there it was, beneath each dated entry for Carter Miles, instead of a signature or even initials, was a symbol. A key coiled perfectly inside the petals of a stylized flower. A dahlia. His breath caught. It wasn't possible, not coincidental. For 3 full years Carter Miles had been marking his attendance not with his name, but with a personal emblem. One that matched the exact design hidden in Hannah's cello. No one had questioned it at the time. Teachers joked about it, Miles with his artist nonsense, someone once said. Martin had dismissed it too, but now, with fresh context, that symbol had a different weight. It was no longer eccentricity. It was a trail. Driven by a sudden, fierce resolve, Martin copied the symbol and made multiple scans of the logbook pages. Then he turned to what little digital trail remained. Carter Miles had no public online presence, no forwarding address, no listed relatives. But Martin remembered the brief conversation between the two teachers at school years ago. Oregon City, maybe. It was a vague lead, but it was a starting point. He began with property records, county by county. Narrowing his search to rural areas within a 150-mile radius, he focused on parcels purchased in the mid-80s to early 90s under names that didn't correspond with local family histories. Most led nowhere. But then, buried deep in the tax records of Benton County, he found it. A modest agricultural plot purchased in 1987 under the name Gregory Stanton. 18 acres, primarily listed as pasture land. The mailing address matched a small-town post office in a place called Elderbrook, just off the state highway, 135 miles from Maple Glen. Martin's stomach turned. Gregory. A variant of Carter's middle name, he recalled. Stanton. It wasn't familiar, but the handwriting on the deed record, visible through a scanned copy, bore a chilling resemblance to the precise strokes from the letters in the cello. He didn't call ahead. He didn't think. He just packed a small bag, grabbed the folder containing the photo, the letters, the time card copies, and drove. The February air was sharp against the windshield as he made his way down Route 20, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Elderbrook was as unremarkable as its name, a single diner, one general store, a gas station where the clerk seemed confused to see a new face. "The Stanton place?" the young man repeated when Martin asked. "Out past Willow Creek. Don't get many folks heading that way." The road narrowed into gravel. Fences lined with rusted barbed wire flanked his path, and trees loomed on either side like disinterested sentinels. He spotted the mailbox first, battered, dented, marked only with a sticker of a dahlia, faded almost to white. Beyond the gate lay a long dirt drive that cut through dying grass and opened onto a plain farmhouse, paint peeling, shutters hanging loose like half-closed eyes. Martin parked off the road. He didn't approach immediately. From a distance the house looked empty, but to the left stood a barn, old, red, functional, and farther still a greenhouse structure half concealed from winter winds. No signs of livestock, no vehicles, just quiet. He pulled out a pair of binoculars from the glove box, a habit left from hiking trips long before grief took over his weekends, and scanned the area. At the rear of the barn, a solar panel. Small, modern, odd, considering the rest of the place looked 2 decades out of time. Someone lived here. Someone who didn't want to be seen. He took photos of the barn, of the dahlia sticker, of the mailbox. Then he walked back toward his car, breathing heavy with questions he wasn't yet ready to answer. In a town hall archive back in Maple Glen, Carter Miles had vanished, but out here in Elderbrook, under a new name, new soil, and a symbol he'd never quite let go of, Greg Stanton had started again. Or perhaps had continued something he never meant to stop. Martin climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His folder sat beside him, the photo of Hannah now resting atop the letters like a silent witness. He didn't know yet what he was going to do, but he knew this. The man at the center of all this hadn't disappeared. He had buried himself. And Martin had just dug him up. Martin returned to Elderbrook the following morning under the pretense of documenting rural land for a university research project. He wore a worn flannel, khakis dusted with roadside grit, and an old camera around his neck to blend in. When he pulled up a few hundred feet from the entrance to the Stanton property, he kept his car angled just enough to see the driveway, but not block it. He stayed there for an hour. The house remained still, no movement behind the broken blinds, no cars coming or going. But what struck him was what lay behind the main house, something he hadn't noticed the day before. At the rear edge of the property, half concealed by overgrown hedges and flanked by dried shrubs, was a smaller structure. It wasn't a shed. It was too clean, too recent in its construction. The siding, unlike the flaking white paint of the farmhouse, gleamed faintly under the morning sun. Martin walked the tree line, pretending to birdwatch, until he got close enough to see it clearly. It was a guest house, or perhaps a studio, but what didn't fit was the pair of matte-banked security cameras mounted at its corners, angled precisely toward the entrance and the single side window. A sleek wireless antenna stuck up from the roof. New tech, expensive. Not something a reclusive farmer living on a neglected property would typically invest in, unless there was something inside he needed to monitor. or hide. He took photos, carefully avoiding reflections. Then he circled around the eastern perimeter of the lot and headed into town, where he made his way to the only diner on Main Street. The place smelled like burnt bacon and dish soap. Inside, two men nursed coffees near the register. Martin ordered black coffee and struck up conversation with the young man behind the counter, a wiry 20-something with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Sean. Martin mentioned the Stanton place casually, as if curious about rural real estate. Sean hesitated. Not much to say. He's quiet, keeps to himself, doesn't come into town unless it's supply day. Martin pressed lightly. Ever get deliveries out there? Sean wiped a mug and nodded. Used to drive for Eldermid Courier before this. We dropped off meds monthly for a while, signed off under Greg Stanton. Martin leaned in. What kind of meds? Sean raised an eyebrow. Anti-anxiety stuff, low-dose benzos. I saw the labor profile. That's unusual for long-term use, but not dangerous. Just steady sedation. Martin's mouth went dry. That's unusual for someone living alone, isn't it? Sean shrugged. Technically, yeah. He's not listed as under any care program, doesn't claim disability, no caretaker on file, but he signed every package himself, always sober, always polite. He paused, then added quietly, You know the weird thing? No one's ever seen anyone else come out of that house. But the pharmacy form, the one I had to verify for delivery, had household total, 2 scratched out and corrected by hand. Said it was a mistake, but Sean trailed off. Martin didn't speak. He sipped his bitter coffee, his mind racing. He thanked Sean, left a tip, and walked back to his car parked down the street. The puzzle was warping. The symbols, the letters, the photo, they had been whispers. But this was nearly a shout. A man living under a false name, alone on paper, but with drugs consistent with long-term chemical restraint. A guest house behind his property fitted with long-term chemical restraint. Room designed not to keep things out, but to keep something or someone in. Martin drove back toward the property, but this time he didn't stop at the front. Instead, he parked half a mile up a dirt service trail that skirted the rear edge of Stanton's land. From there, he walked the tree line, boots sinking into wet moss, heart pounding with each step. He moved carefully, ducking behind hedges, tracking the sight lines of the mounted camera. It took him nearly 20 minutes to reach a vantage point close enough to study the guest house in detail. Its windows were frosted. The door was steel. Keypad lock blinked red. No prints were in the dirt around it, but the ground was dry, impossible to tell when it was last approached. He crouched low in the underbrush and waited, watching for any sign of life. At dusk, lights flickered on, soft, yellow, too warm for LEDs. They didn't pulse like standard bulbs. These were custom, low-lux interior lamps, designed to mimic natural light in a space that had no sun. Martin held his breath. For a brief moment, a figure passed behind the window. Not a man's shape, smaller, slender, head bowed. It was gone in a second, but he knew what he'd seen. He backed away slowly, heart in his throat, drove back to town under cover of darkness. That night, he didn't sleep. He opened the photo from the cello again. The shadows, the shape, the absence of windows. Then he opened the one he'd taken that afternoon, of the guest house lit at dusk. They weren't the same room, but they were designed the same way. He was almost certain now. Greg Stanton wasn't living alone. Martin returned to Maple Glen with a weight in his chest that was no longer grief, but transformation. The image of the silhouette behind the frosted window of Stanton's guest house haunted him with relentless clarity, overlapping with every faded photograph of Hannah he'd ever stored in the filing cabinets of memory. He had seen her, or what was left of her, but he didn't yet have proof, only pieces. And so, like he had done for years, Martin tried to live within the rhythm of his search, working in libraries, gathering fragments of knowledge while quietly unraveling. It was during the spring that he accepted a guest lecturer position at a music theory symposium held in Eugene, Oregon, hosted by a small but passionate group of educators and amateur musicians. The event was modest, a mixture of technical panels, workshop booths, and evening performances from unsigned local talent. Martin hadn't planned to attend the final recital. It had been a long day, and the folding chair dug into his spine. But something, A familiar tug held him there as a young woman stepped onto the small wooden stage and placed a portable CD player next to the microphone. "Glen tonight with a composition submitted anonymously," she said, adjusting her glasses. "No title, just the initials HW and a number. Recorded on an old analog upright in a single take. The panel found it difficult to categorize." She pressed play. The first note floated into the room like a breath held too long, then another. The left hand arched beneath the melody with eerie restraint, while the right hand danced just ahead of the tempo, fluid, nervous, intuitive. Martin straightened. It was a habit she'd had, one he'd never seen taught. Not even her instructors had managed to replicate it. A slight hesitation between phrases, as if she was listening for a second voice only she could hear. The room faded around him, the audience blurred. He heard the girl at age 12 practicing in the living room, her feet barely touching the pedals, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had always played like that, like she was translating something too fragile for speech. As the final chord rang out, a minor seventh that lingered, unresolved, Martin's heart thudded violently against his ribs. He approached the table near the soundboard, where a short stack of CDRs were offered for free. Each was marked with a cheap paper label, untitled HW 238. The number clawed at him. He turned the disc over in his hand. 238, August 23rd. The day she disappeared. He barely slept that night. Instead, he loaded the track onto his laptop and played it over and over, dissecting every bar, every breath between notes. He compared it with old recordings of Hannah, school recitals, Christmas concerts, grainy camcorder tapes, where her voice rang louder than the piano, but her phrasing was unmistakable. The fingerprints of her soul were embedded in the melody. The next day, he returned to the event venue and asked the organizers for the composer's information. They looked confused, then politely declined. Anonymous, they reminded him. They didn't provide contact details, just said they were self-taught, private. "Live somewhere outside Eugene, near the hills." "We didn't press," Martin insisted. Showed the photo, explained the disappearance. Still, no one could offer more than what he already had. A P.O. box from the submission form, registered to a rural postal route about an hour west of Elderbrook. The coincidence was too exact. Hannah had not only survived, but suddenly found a company that was brilliant. Everything pointed toward what he already feared was true. Hannah had not only survived, she had continued to create. But from where? Under what conditions? He tracked the P.O. box to a remote stretch near Sweetwater Ridge, a region of sparse development and winding dirt roads. When he visited the postal office, he feigned interest in renting a box in the same zone, asking about volume, frequency, usual senders. The elderly clerk, unaware of his real intent, mentioned that Box 238 received packages about once a month, usually music paper, sometimes audio tapes. "Odd thing," she added. "They never pick up in person. Always a courier. Little brown car. Doesn't even idle. Just in and out." Martin's pulse quickened. He drove the back roads for 2 days, sketching the region, identifying every property that intersected with a straight path between Elderbrook and Sweetwater Ridge. There weren't many, but one stood out, the Stanton farm. He returned there late one evening. This time he brought headphones and a recorder. He played the track, HW 238, while sitting across the field, eyes locked on the guest house window, and just before the light flicked off, he saw the shape inside turn toward the sound, just slightly, as if recognizing it, as if she had been waiting for someone to remember. After his second sighting of the silhouette in the guest house, Martin began to wonder whether Stanton, or Carter, as he could never stop thinking of him, had started the cycle over again. If Hannah had once been a prodigy shaped under this man's obsessive eye, was it possible another had taken her place? He began checking nearby schools, music studios, and tutoring boards for names linked to Greg Stanton. It took less than 2 days before he found one. Emily Ralston, 16, piano student, had been listed as performing under mentorship of G. Stanton at a recent community recital in a church bulletin from Elderbrook's quarterly arts newsletter. Her photo, a smiling brunette with wary eyes, sent a cold shiver down Martin's spine. She looked nothing like Hannah, but something like Hannah, trained, held. He waited outside the Elderbrook music shop, where Emily's name was listed as a registered student. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, he saw her exit, violin case strapped to her back, earbuds in, hoodie drawn up to alarm her. He followed from a distance, careful not to alarm her. She turned into the local library, and that's where he made his approach, slipping into the same aisle minutes after she had settled into a study nook. "Excuse me," he said gently, pretending to fumble with sheet music in his hands. "Do you study under Greg Stanton?" She looked up, startled. "Who's asking?" Martin softened his tone, offering a warm, rehearsed smile. "I heard him play once, just curious who he's teaching now." Beautiful phrasing. Emily shrugged, but her shoulders were tight, her voice flat. "Yeah, I guess." Her fingers twitched on the edge of her notebook. "You've been with him long?" Martin asked. "A year," she said. "Mostly piano, some theory." Martin leaned slightly. "Do you enjoy it?" She hesitated, then nodded out. "Lot 12. "He's strict, knows a lot, not like school." Martin noticed the way her eyes flicked toward the hallway every time a door clicked or a footstep echoed. Once, when the janitor's keys jingled down the hall, she physically flinched. He shifted the conversation. "You live in town?" Emily answered cautiously. "Outside, with my mom." She stood to leave. "I have to go." Martin nodded, thanked her, and stepped aside. But something in her tone stayed with him. Not fear exactly, but a drilled vigilance, as if she had learned to anticipate correction before it arrived. The next day, he tracked down her address through school district records. Her home sat near the edge of Elderbrook's farming zone, only 2 miles from Stanton's property. He parked nearby and approached as a utility inspector, clipboard in hand. Emily's mother answered the door, a tired woman with soft lines and a guarded smile. When Martin explained he was doing a quick property survey for a local historical grant, she invited him inside. The house was modest, clean, filled with the faint scent of lavender. On the coffee table were music sheets and pencil-mark theory drills. "You said Emily studies under Greg Stanton," he asked casually. She nodded. "Yes, he's unconventional, but she's learning a lot. Hasn't missed a lesson." "How did you find him?" "Well," she said. He reached out through the community bulletin board. Said he was looking to teach serious students privately. She was playing Chopin back then, but he moved her into original work. Matt felt his chest tighten. "Original?" She nodded. Teachers heard her compose, says music should come from memory, not repetition. As she stepped away to check on the kettle, Martin's eyes wandered. On the side table near the window, half tucked beneath a stack of music books, he saw a cloth-covered journal. On instinct, he moved to glance. A page jutted out, lined in neat blue ink. The red reading lights before his book had returned. "He said he had a music daughter before me, but she stopped obeying. She tried to change the tempo. That's why she had to leave." Martin snapped the book closed and stepped away just in time. Emily's mother returned with 2 mugs. "She's shy," she said. "But he's been good for her, really understands how to push her." Martin nodded politely, but his hands trembled. He finished the tea quickly, thanked her, and left. In his car, he stared out the windshield, the words repeating like a metronome in his mind. "Music daughter." Stopped obeying, had to leave. He didn't know how long he sat there, but the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the pavement. He made a decision. He had to go back to the Stanton property, not to watch, not to wonder, to listen. Martin knew he couldn't wait any longer. After reading Emily's journal entry, after witnessing her nervous tics, after confirming the unmistakable signature of Hannah's piano playing in the anonymous composition, he knew whatever was happening behind the locked door of the Stanton guest house had to end, and soon. It took him 4 days to gather the courage and the legal leverage. He presented his findings to the local sheriff, photos of the surveillance cameras, the medication orders, the letters with the dahlia symbol, and finally the photo of the girl inside the guest house, cross-referenced with the school records and missing persons report from 1983. The sheriff, initially skeptical, began shifting in his seat when Martin played the piano recording side by side with a childhood tape of Hannah. The resemblance was chilling. After a moment of silence, the sheriff folded his arms and asked Martin to step outside. By nightfall, a quiet team was assembled, 2 plainclothes officers, a local EMT, and 1 state investigator with a warrant. Martin wasn't supposed to go, but he made them promise. If she was there, if she was alive, he needed to be the one she saw. At 2:17 a.m., under a moonless sky, they entered the property with their headlights off. The wind carried the smell of damp soil, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath boots. The main house was empty, lights off, doors locked, but undisturbed. Stanton was nowhere in sight. The team moved swiftly to the guest house, and Martin watched as one of the officers pried open the keypad lock using a bypass device. It clicked open with a mechanical hiss, and the steel door gave way to reveal a narrow corridor, dimly lit with track lights that led down a short stairwell. The walls were lined with acoustic foam. The air felt unnaturally still, as if sound itself had been erased. They descended slowly, every footstep muffled. At the bottom was a heavy wooden door, with a small rectangular pane of soundproof glass. Inside, barely illuminated by soft amber light, was a room like no other Martin had seen. It was a music studio, but not the kind built for production. This one was clinical, symmetrical, stripped of comfort. A piano sat at the center, its keys perfectly polished. To the side was a twin bed with white linens, a metal desk, and several stacks of handwritten sheet music. Soundproof healing lined every wall, floor to ceiling. There were no windows, and sitting at the piano, her back straight, hands resting in her lap, was a woman. Short, dark hair cut plainly, skin pale from lack of sun. Her posture poised yet lifeless. She did not turn, did not flinch, just sat, as if frozen in ritual. Martin stepped forward, the officers hesitating behind him. "Hannah," he whispered. No response. He moved closer, his throat tight. "Hannah? It's me." Still nothing. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring ahead at the wall, not the keys. The officer beside him checked the room. No restraints, no chains, but the silence itself, like captivity. Martin saw the shelf with her music and walked to it with shaking hands. He pulled the top piece of paper. It was a song title he recognized. August Drift. A piece she had begun at 13 but never finished. His fingers trembling, he sat at the piano beside her and began playing. One note, then two, then the melody. Soft, nostalgic, fragile. The moment the third bar began, she blinked, a small flickering movement. Her head tilted slightly, her lips parted just an inch. Martin continued, his fingers remembering the exact tempo she had once hummed to herself in their living room. He reached the chorus and her hand twitched. Then her head slowly turned. Her eyes met his, gray, distant, clouded with confusion, but they locked. And then, in a voice barely above breath, she whispered, "You remembered." Martin broke. Tears ran freely as he nodded, unable to speak. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above his on the keys, and pressed down the final note. A sharp perfect. Her voice cracked again, barely audible. He said, "You forgot that I was gone." Martin took her hand. "Never!" Behind them, the officers watched, stunned. One radioed for medical support. Another began taking photographs of the room. But Martin didn't care about the legal process, the aftermath, the headlines that might follow. Because his daughter was alive, and she remembered her music. In the sterile calm of the recovery room at St. Agnes Medical Center, Hannah lay under warm blankets, the IV line snaking into her arm, the steady beep of the monitor the only sound punctuating the hush. It had been 48 hours since the discovery in the soundproofed room. Her body had been dehydrated but intact, muscles lean from daily practice, skin pale but unscarred. It was her mind that bore the deeper fractures, silences too thick for words, eyes that tracked corners of the room as if fearing invisible watchers, speech that came in slow pieces like notes from a forgotten melody. Martin sat beside her every hour they allowed, never pushing, only being there. It was on the third day that she spoke in full sentences. The psychiatrist, a gentlewoman named Druck Renee Markel, had urged the session be recorded, with consent, to ensure accuracy and safeguard future legal proceedings. Martin was allowed to sit in the corner, his hands folded tightly in his lap, as Hannah began her account. She said it started slowly. The first few weeks after her disappearance were a blur. She remembered being in a car, a motel, a place with heavy curtains and no clocks. Greg, though she had never called him that, had told her the world was full of noise, of corrupting voices. He had said she was special, chosen, a vessel of raw harmony. He gave her music to memorize, simple at first, and told her if she played without mistakes, she would earn light, 10 minutes of sunlight, a glass of juice, a chance to hear a bird outside the window. She learned quickly that errors brought silence, that crying brought isolation. That silence was punishment. "I wasn't allowed to speak unless spoken to," she said quietly, eyes fixed on a corner of the floor. He said language weakens instinct, that if I forgot the world's words, I could hear the real music underneath. She had been sedated, low doses at first, to quiet the modern mind, he said. Over time, the medication became routine, a liquid in her morning tea. She didn't always feel drugged, but her limbs would move slower some days, her focus narrowed unnaturally. She was not beaten, she said, but molded, with rules, repetition, and constant correction. She was made to play the same compositions hundreds of times, then compose variations in strict keys and time signatures. He called it the Purity Program, she whispered. He said I was perfect, others would come. Martin's hands trembled as she spoke, his mind filled with the image of Emily, the next phase. In the following days, law enforcement began to piece together the legal timeline. Stanton's real name, Carter Miles, was confirmed via fingerprint match, but the story went deeper. In sealed records unearthed with the help of a whistleblower inside the Maple Glen School District, it was revealed that 20 years prior, Miles had been quietly dismissed after allegations of inappropriate behavior with a student surfaced. The student, a 7th-grade violinist, had told a guidance counselor that Miles insisted on closed-door sessions, prolonged physical adjustments, and once followed her home. But the report never reached local police. The school board had cited internal discipline and swiftly issued a resignation letter that painted his departure as voluntary. The reason, Carter's father, Franklin Miles, had been the school's large benefactor. The Miles Family Foundation had funded the entire music wing renovation, including a full orchestra program. No one wanted scandal. No one wanted the program jeopardized. So the file was buried, and Carter Miles left quietly. That decision, Martin now realized, had paved the way for Hannah's objection. He stood by the hospital window, late one evening, hand in his pockets, watching rain fall across the parking lot. He wondered how many people knew, how many administrators had looked the other way for the sake of funding, for reputation, for order. Back in the room, Hannah was sketching music on hospital paper with a dull pencil. She no longer needed sedation, but she still startled at loud noises. She flinched when someone knocked, but when Martin hummed one of her old pieces, the one she had written in 6th grade, River of Echoes, her eyes would soften, and her fingers would find the invisible keys on the blanket. The doctors said it would take time. That full memory recovery was uncertain. That institutionalization had effects even the best clinicians couldn't predict. But Martin wasn't concerned with certainty, only with keeping her safe. The courtroom smelled of old varnish and dust, its walls lined with faded portraits of judges long since retired, eyes gazing down from heavy frames as if bearing witness to every testimony. Emily sat straight in the witness box, her hands folded neatly on her lap, but her fingers twitched slightly. Whether from nerves or muscle memory, Martin couldn't tell. When asked to state her relationship to the defendant, she cleared her throat and said clearly, "He was my piano teacher." She paused, glanced briefly at the defense table where Carter Miles, Greg Stanton, sat with a blank expression, and continued, "For nearly a year, he taught me at his home, alone. No one else was ever there." Her voice didn't shake. Martin sat behind her, just 2 rows from the front, and watched as the young girl took a breath and began to describe the rituals, the rigid schedules, the hours of repetition, the subtle punishments that came not as raised voices or strikes, but as silence, disapproval, emotional withdrawal. "He called it untraining," she said, her voice gaining strength, "that I had to forget how normal people learn music. He'd tell me to close my eyes and listen for the sound beneath the sound. He'd stare if I missed a note. Not say anything, just wait, until I corrected it." The prosecutor let her speak freely. Emily talked about the times he'd confiscate her phone, saying technology polluted her focus, about the doors that locked automatically once the lesson started, about how she'd stopped speaking at school for a while because words cluttered the rhythm. It had known parts of this, but hearing it like this, on record, under oath, was something else. It was the same playbook, the same psychological erosion, only the names and instruments had changed. Emily's testimony triggered a ripple across the courtroom and beyond. That same week, local and national outlets picked up the story. The Emily Method called it. Headlines ran across Oregon, and parents who had quietly accepted the oddities of certain elite music mentors began stepping forward. Tips poured in. Allegations of emotional manipulation, sleep restriction, disciplinary soundproof rooms. It turned out Carter wasn't the only one. His method had influenced others. He had spoken at underground symposiums for pedagogical purity years before. The State Education Board launched a full investigation into unlicensed independent music programs. Several private instructors across the state were suspended pending review. But Hannah didn't follow the case anymore. Not directly. She knew enough. She had testified by video once, quietly, clearly, but otherwise she had chosen not to engage with the media. Her healing wasn't a performance. After 2 months in the care center, she declined to return to Maple Glen. The memories there, though rooted in love, were too thick with echoing. Instead, she chose a small coastal town at the southern edge of Oregon, where the mornings came wrapped in fog and the waves never sounded the same twice. She rented a modest cottage with peeling blue shutters and turned the sunroom into a music space. She kept the piano simple, upright, old, slightly out of tune. She began offering lessons at the local library. Only to kids, only those who played for joy. Her rule was firm: no auditions, no recitals, no trophies. She taught rhythm by walking barefoot in the sand, taught pitch by listening to birds. One afternoon, as she sat with a 10-year-old boy trying to master a basic progression, he looked up at her and asked innocently, "Miss Hannah, why don't you perform on big stages? My mom says you're like a genius." Hannah smiled, not tight-lipped or awkward, but wide and full. She rested her hand gently on the keyboard, then replied, "I've already lived that life behind locked doors." The boy didn't understand. He didn't need to. He simply nodded and went back to his scale. That was enough. Martin visited her once every 2 weeks, staying at a small inn nearby. They didn't talk much about the past. Sometimes they played duets. Sometimes they sat on the porch and listened to the ocean. One evening she showed him a new composition, simple, melodic, unfinished. "I don't name them anymore," she said. "It's better that way." He nodded, knowing there were pieces of her he would never fully recover. But the music was back, and more importantly, it was hers. At the edge of that coastal town, where gulls cried above misty cliffs and children laughed down sandy lanes, a woman who once vanished from the world now lived quietly, freely, note by note, in a melody that belonged entirely to her. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true style mysteries told through emotional storytelling. What part of Hannah's journey shocked you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.